The students at Lincoln Valley High had no idea their substitute English teacher had once infiltrated terrorist cells in Eastern Europe. They were about to find out the hard way. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elsa Chun adjusted her wire-rimmed glasses and smoothed down her conservative gray cardigan as she stood before her third period. Honors English class. At 34, she looked every inch the stereotypical substitute teacher with her hair pulled back in a neat bun, sensible flats, and a soft-spoken demeanor that seemed to invite testing from teenage students. The stack of lesson plans on her desk bore the neat handwriting of Mrs. Patterson, the regular teacher who'd been out for 2 weeks with pneumonia. "Good morning, class," Elsa said in her gentle voice, barely above a whisper. "I know you're all eager to get back to your study of Macbeth. Today we'll be discussing the psychological deterioration of the main characters and how guilt manifests in their behavior." A few students in the front row opened their notebooks dutifully, but Elsa's trained eye caught the subtle signs of rebellion brewing in the back corner. 3 seniors sat clustered together, their body language screaming defiance. She'd memorized their names from the seating chart. Derek Morrison, the obvious ringleader with perfectly styled brown hair and the kind of confident smirk that came from never facing real consequences. Beside him sat his lieutenant, Chase Williams, a stocky boy with calculating eyes who seemed to enjoy others' discomfort. The third member of their trio was Brett Collins, tall and lanky with the nervous energy of someone desperate to prove himself to his more dominant friends. Elsa had encountered their type before, though in vastly different circumstances. Cocky, entitled young men who believed their privilege made them untouchable. In her former life, she'd dealt with similar personalities in war-torn regions, where they held actual power and weapons. High school bullies seemed almost quaint by comparison. "Miss Chun," Derek called out, deliberately using the wrong title despite her repeated corrections about being called Miss Chun. "This substitute stuff is getting old. When is Patterson coming back?" At least she knew how to make class interesting. "Mrs. Patterson will return when she's recovered from her illness," Elsa replied calmly, continuing to write the day's objectives on the whiteboard. "In the meantime, we have important material to cover. Please open your books to Act 5, Scene 1. Chase leaned back in his chair with exaggerated boredom. "You know what? I don't think I brought my book today. Guess I can't participate." His tone was challenging, testing to see how this mild-mannered substitute would respond to open defiance. "That's perfectly fine," Elsa said without turning around. "I have extra copies. Brett, would you mind grabbing one from the shelf for Chase?" Brett looked confused, caught off guard by being directly addressed. Sure, I guess." Derek's smirk faltered slightly. Most substitutes would have either ignored the defiance or launched into a lecture about responsibility. This woman had simply solved the problem without engaging in a power struggle. "Actually, Brett, don't worry about it. I'm sure Chase can get his own book if he really wants to learn about some dead Scottish guy. Macbeth isn't just about a Scottish king," Elsa said, finally turning to face the class. Her voice remained soft, but there was something in her eyes that made even the front-row students pay attention. "It's about the corruption of power, the weight of guilt, and how people reveal their true nature when they think no one is watching." She let that statement hang in the air for a moment before continuing. "It's also about consequences. Every action in the play leads to an inevitable result. The characters who think they can manipulate others without facing repercussions learn otherwise." Derek felt like the comment was directed at him, which irritated him further. Who did this substitute think she was, trying to intimidate him with some philosophical nonsense about a stupid play? For the next 20 minutes, Elsa conducted what was actually an engaging discussion about the psychological themes in Macbeth. Several students found themselves drawn into the conversation despite their initial reluctance. She had a way of asking questions that made them think of connecting the centuries-old drama to modern psychology and human behavior. But Derek, Chase, and Brett weren't interested in learning. They were planning. "She thinks she's so smart," Derek whispered to his friends during a brief moment when Elsa was helping a student in the front row. Little Miss Perfect with her boring clothes and her whisper voice. "I bet she's never had a real job in her life. She's probably one of those people who went straight from college to substitute teaching," Chase added. "Never lived in the real world." Brett nodded eagerly. "My dad says teachers are just people who couldn't make it in actual careers. That's why they hide in schools." What they didn't know was that Elsa had spent 12 years in the CIA, with 7 of those years working undercover in some of the world's most dangerous regions. She'd learned to read people's intentions from micro-expressions, to identify threats before they materialized, and to project whatever persona was necessary for survival. The mild-mannered substitute teacher was just another cover, though this time she was using it to protect teenagers from themselves, rather than to infiltrate criminal organizations. She'd retired from the agency 2 years ago after a mission in Prague had gone sideways, leaving her with a bullet scar on her left shoulder and a profound weariness with violence. Teaching had seemed like a peaceful alternative, a chance to use her skills for something constructive. She'd completed her teaching certification and started substitute teaching while pursuing her master's degree in education. Most of the time, she genuinely enjoyed the work. Teenagers were challenging in their own way, but their problems were refreshingly normal compared to arms dealers and human traffickers. Usually, the worst she had to deal with was phones being used during class or students trying to turn in late assignments. But every school seemed to have its Derek Morrison, its little tyrant who ruled through intimidation and social manipulation. In her short time at Lincoln Valley High, she'd already heard stories about Derek's treatment of younger students, his cruel pranks, and his ability to make teachers' lives miserable. The administration seemed reluctant to take serious action, possibly because Derek's father was a prominent attorney who'd successfully sued the district before. "Miss Chun," Derek called out again, his voice carrying across the classroom. "I have a question about the play." "Of course, Derek. What would you like to know?" "Well, I was wondering about Lady Macbeth's character. Some people think she's strong and powerful, but isn't she really just a manipulative woman who uses her feminine wiles to get what she wants?" Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Derek's tone was ostensibly academic, but there was an undercurrent of something else. Elsa recognized the tactic immediately, the loaded question designed to provoke a reaction. "That's an interesting interpretation," she replied evenly. "What evidence from the text supports your view?" Derek hadn't expected to be asked for textual evidence. He'd been hoping to bait her into an argument about gender roles or feminism, topics that typically got teachers worked up. "Well, she basically seduces Macbeth into murder." "That's pretty manipulative." "The text suggests their relationship is more complex than simple manipulation," Elsa said. "If you look at Act 1, Scene 7, you'll see that Macbeth has already considered murdering Duncan before Lady Macbeth becomes involved. She doesn't plant the idea. She reinforces his existing ambition." Chase jumped in, sensing his friend needed backup. "But she definitely uses her sexuality to convince him. That's what women do when they can't get their way through legitimate means." The classroom went dead silent. Even the students who'd been doodling in their notebooks looked up, sensing that something significant had just happened. Chase's comment had crossed a line from literary discussion into something much more personal and inappropriate. Elsa set down her marker and walked slowly to the center of the room. Her movements were deliberate, controlled. In her former life, this kind of calculated calm had preceded some very unpleasant conversations with very dangerous people. "Chase," she said, her voice still soft but carrying a new quality that made everyone in the room pay attention. Could you elaborate on what you mean by legitimate means? Chase suddenly realized he might have overstepped, but Derek was watching him expectantly. He couldn't back down now. I just mean that some people try to use manipulation instead of, actual arguments or logic. I see, Elsa nodded thoughtfully. And you believe this is specifically a feminine trait? I didn't say that, Chase replied quickly, but his defensive tone suggested otherwise. You said, that's what women do. That seems like a pretty broad generalization for about half the human population. Derek decided to rescue his friend. Come on, Ms. Chen, don't be so sensitive. Chase was just making an observation about the character. This is supposed to be a literature class, not a political correctness seminar. You're absolutely right. Derek, this is a literature class, which means we discuss themes, character development, and textual evidence. Personal attacks disguised as literary analysis don't contribute to that discussion. Personal attacks? Derek's voice rose slightly. Nobody attacked anybody. We're just talking about a play. Are we? Elsa's question hung in the air. Because it sounded like Chase was making a statement about women in general, not about Lady Macbeth specifically. Brett, who'd been quiet through this exchange, chose this moment to add his voice. Maybe you're reading too much into it, Ms. Chen. Chase was just saying that some characters use manipulation. It's not that deep. Elsa turned her attention to Brett, and he immediately regretted speaking up. There was something unsettling about the way she looked at him, as if she could see right through his attempt at casual dismissal. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Brett, when you say it's not that deep, what exactly do you mean? Are you suggesting that Shakespeare's psychological insights aren't worth examining? Or are you saying that discussions about gender roles and power dynamics aren't relevant to understanding the text? Brett opened his mouth, then closed it again, clearly out of his depth. He'd expected a simple deflection, not a serious academic question that required actual thought. Derek was getting frustrated with how the conversation was going. This substitute was supposed to be easy to rattle, but she kept turning their provocations back into actual teaching moments. It was infuriating. Look, Miss Chen, he said, emphasizing her name with slight mockery. I think you're taking this way too seriously. We're just high school students trying to have a discussion about a boring old play. Maybe you should lighten up a little. Lighten up. Elsa repeated the phrase thoughtfully. That's interesting advice, Derek. Tell me, when someone suggests that half the population resorts to manipulation rather than logic, and another person finds that concerning, your solution is for the concerned party to lighten up? Derek felt trapped by her logic but couldn't articulate why. I'm just saying, don't make it into a big deal when it's not. Who decides what constitutes a big deal? Elsa asked. In my experience, the people who benefit from certain behaviors are often the ones who suggest others shouldn't be concerned about them. Chase decided to try a different approach. Ms. Chen, no offense, but you're just a substitute teacher. You don't really know us or understand how we talk to each other. This is just how we discuss things. There it was, the attempt to diminish her authority by questioning her credentials and experience. Elsa had heard variations of this dismissal countless times, usually from men who assumed her quiet demeanor indicated weakness or incompetence. You're right, Chase. I don't know you very well yet, but I am beginning to understand how you discuss things. She paused, letting her words sink in. And I'm starting to form some opinions about what that says about your character. The room was completely silent now. Even students who'd been half asleep were paying attention, sensing the tension building between their classmates and the substitute teacher. Derek realized they were losing this battle of words. The substitute was too skilled at turning their attacks back on them, too calm in the face of their provocation. It was time to escalate. You know what, Miss Chen? I think you're right. We should discuss character. His voice took on a new edge, more calculated and cruel. I've been wondering about yours since you started here. I mean, what kind of person becomes a career substitute teacher? Couldn't cut it in a real job? Couldn't handle the pressure of actual responsibility? Several students gasped quietly. Derek had just crossed a major line, moving from academic discussion to personal attack on a teacher. Even his friends looked uncomfortable with the escalation, but Elsa didn't flinch. If anything, she seemed to become more focused, more present. That's an interesting question, Derek. What do you think qualifies as a real job or actual responsibility? Derek sensed he'd finally found a weak spot. I mean, let's be honest. Teaching is what people do when they can't succeed in the real world. My dad always says those who can't do, teach. And those who can't teach, substitute teach. The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Derek was clearly proud of himself, expecting to see hurt or anger in the substitute's eyes. Instead, he saw something that made him vaguely uncomfortable. A kind of patient assessment, as if she were evaluating him for some purpose he didn't understand. Your father sounds like a wise man, Elsa said finally. Does he have much experience with teaching? He's a lawyer, Derek replied proudly. A successful one. He deals with real problems and real consequences, not just talking about old books. All day. Lawyers certainly do handle important work, Elsa agreed. Though I imagine there are many different types of success and many different ways to serve society. Derek interpreted her diplomatic response as weakness. Come on, Ms. Chun. You don't have to pretend like substitute teaching is some noble calling. We all know you're just here because you couldn't make it anywhere else. Chase and Brett were watching this exchange with growing excitement. Derek was finally getting under the substitute's skin, and they sensed an opportunity to join the attack. Derek's. Right, Chase added. I mean, no offense, but what did you do before this? Sit around your apartment reading books and applying for jobs you couldn't get. Brett nodded eagerly. Yeah, what's your background? Did you even go to college? The questions were designed to embarrass her, to expose her as unqualified and unsuccessful. They expected stammering explanations about teaching certificates and community college courses. Instead, Elsa smiled slightly, not a warm, teacher-appropriate smile, but something cooler and more calculating. I did go to college, Brett. Georgetown, actually. Double major in international relations and psychology, with a minor in Middle Eastern studies. Derek felt his confidence waver slightly. Georgetown was a prestigious university, more impressive than he'd expected. Okay, so you went to a good school. That just makes it more pathetic that you ended up as a substitute teacher. I also speak 6 languages fluently, Elsa continued in the same conversational tone. Arabic, Farsi, Russian, Mandarin, French, and Spanish. I spent several years working overseas in various diplomatic positions. Chase laughed mockingly. Diplomatic positions? What, like working at embassies and filing paperwork? Something like that, Elsa replied. But there was something in her voice that made the laughter die in Chase's throat. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. Students began packing up their belongings, but the tension in the room remained thick. Derek, Chase, and Brett lingered as the other students filed out, clearly feeling like they'd started something that wasn't finished. This was fun, Ms. Chun, Derek said with mock sincerity. I hope we can continue our discussion about career choices tomorrow. I'm sure we will, Elsa replied, beginning to erase the whiteboard. Though you might want to think about what you learned today about consequences and character revelation. After the students left, Elsa sat quietly at her desk for a few minutes, processing what had just happened. She'd encountered hostile interrogation from trained professionals, but there was something particularly frustrating about teenage boys who'd never faced real consequences for their behavior. She thought about her father, who'd immigrated from Taiwan with nothing but determination and a willingness to work 18-hour days. He'd built a successful engineering firm through intelligence, persistence, and treating everyone with respect. Her mother, a second-generation Chinese American, had been a social worker who dedicated her life to helping families in crisis. Neither parent had ever told her that success meant diminishing others or that strength came from making people feel small. They'd raised her to believe that true power came from competence, integrity, and the ability to lift others up rather than tear them down. Derek Morrison and his friends were about to learn that lesson hard way. As she gathered her materials for the next class, Elsa's phone buzzed with a text from her former partner at the agency. "How's the teaching life treating you? Missing the excitement yet?" She thought about Derek's smug face, about Chase's casual misogyny, about Brett's eager participation in cruelty. Then she typed back, "Actually, it's more challenging than I expected. But I think I'm starting to enjoy it." The next period would bring a fresh group of students, but Elsa knew that word would spread quickly through the school's social networks. Derek Morrison's crew would be back tomorrow, probably with reinforcements and a new strategy for breaking down the substitute teacher who'd refused to be intimidated. They had no idea what they were really up against. What they didn't know was that Elsa Chun had spent years in situations where reading people correctly was the difference between life and death, where projecting the right persona could mean the success or failure of a mission that affected national security. She'd learned to be whoever she needed to be, to blend in seamlessly while gathering information, to appear harmless while remaining lethal. High school politics were just another form of intelligence gathering, and Derek Morrison had just revealed exactly who he was and what he was capable of. Tomorrow will be very interesting indeed. The next morning, Derek Morrison arrived at Lincoln Valley High with a plan. He'd spent the previous evening texting his network of friends and allies, building support for what he called Operation Substitute Breakdown. The mild-mannered Miss Chun had embarrassed him in front of the class, and that couldn't stand. His reputation as the untouchable king of the senior class depended on swift retaliation. "She thinks she's clever," Derek explained to his expanded group of followers as they clustered around his locker before the first period. "But she's just another substitute who doesn't understand how things work here. We need to show her that nobody disrespects us and gets away with it." The group had grown from his usual trio to include 6 additional seniors, each eager to participate in bringing down the substitute teacher who dared to challenge their friend. Among them was Jessica Martinez, Derek's on and off girlfriend who enjoyed the social power that came with dating him. There was also Ryan Peterson, a linebacker on the football team who'd been suspended twice for bullying younger students, and Amanda Foster, whose wealthy parents had donated enough to the school that her behavior was rarely questioned. "What exactly did she do?" asked Chloe Wright, a senior who joined the group more out of curiosity than malice. "She totally went off on us for just discussing the book," Chase replied, conveniently omitting the details of their provocative behavior. "Started lecturing us about gender roles and treating us like we were stupid. Then she got all high and mighty about her fancy college education." Brett nodded vigorously. "Yeah, she was super condescending, acting like she's better than everyone, just because she went to Georgetown or whatever." Derek sensed an opportunity to spin the narrative further in his favor. "The worst part was how she singled us out. I mean, we were just participating in class discussion, and she made it personal. That's not professional behavior from a teacher." What Derek was describing bore little resemblance to what had actually happened, but his friends didn't need facts. They needed a cause, and Derek had given them one. The uppity substitute teacher who thought she was too good for Lincoln Valley High. "So what's the plan?" Rayan asked, cracking his knuckles in anticipation. Derek's smile was cold and calculating. "We're going to make her job impossible. Every class we push a little harder. We question everything she says, challenge her authority, make her feel stupid. We get other students to join in, make it seem like the whole school is against her. Won't that get us in trouble? Chloe asked nervously. Not if we're smart about it, Derek replied. We don't do anything that's technically against the rules. We just ask lots of questions, disagree with her interpretations, maybe forget our books a few times. Death by 1,000 cuts. Jessica leaned against Derek's locker, already invested. In the plan. I heard from my friend in second period that she's actually kind of boring. Just stands there reading from the lesson plans and talking in that whisper voice. It should be easy to rattle her. Amanda added her own intelligence to the mix. My mom knows the district supervisor. If we can get some parents to complain about her teaching methods, they'll get rid of her fast. Substitutes have no job protection. The plan was taking shape, and Derek felt the familiar rush of orchestrating someone else's downfall. He'd used similar tactics against other teachers and students over the years, and it had never failed. The key was making it look like the target had brought it on themselves, that they were simply unfit for their position. Remember, Derek emphasized as the group began to disperse for the first period, we're not bullying anyone. We're just concerned about students who want quality education. If she can't handle legitimate classroom discussion, that's her problem. Meanwhile, in the teacher's lounge, Elsa was having coffee with Margaret Stevens, a veteran English teacher who'd been at Lincoln Valley High for over 20 years. Margaret had sought her out after hearing about yesterday's incident from several concerned students. I wanted to give you a heads up about Derek Morrison, Margaret said, keeping her voice low. That boy has been making teachers' lives miserable since his freshman year. He's clever about it, never does anything you can definitively point to as misconduct, but he has a way of making people want to quit. Elsa sipped her coffee thoughtfully. What's his usual pattern? He identifies what he perceives as weakness and exploits it relentlessly. If you're new, he questions your experience. If you're young, he undermines your authority. If you're older, he acts like you're out of touch. He recruits other students to join in, making it seem like a grassroots movement against incompetent teachers. How does the administration handle it? Margaret's laugh was bitter. They don't. His father, Richard Morrison, is a prominent attorney who successfully sued the district twice. Once for allegedly discriminatory discipline practices, once for violating Derek's right to free expression. The principal basically has standing orders to avoid confronting the Morrison family unless absolutely necessary. Elsa processed this information with the analytical mindset she'd developed during years of intelligence work. Derek Morrison wasn't just a typical teenage bully, he was a sophisticated manipulator who'd learned to work within systems to avoid consequences. His father had apparently taught him that legal threats were more effective than physical intimidation. What happened to the last teacher he targeted? Elsa asked. Mrs. Campbell, the substitute who was here before you. She lasted 3 weeks before having what could generously be called a nervous breakdown. Derek and his friends had convinced half her classes that she didn't know the material, got parents calling to complain about her experimental teaching methods, and finally staged a walkout during one of her lessons. A walkout? 23 students just stood up in the middle of class and left, claiming she was wasting their time. They made sure to do it when Principal Harris was walking by the classroom. Mrs. Campbell was so humiliated she never came back. Elsa felt a familiar stirring of anger, the same emotion she'd felt when confronting corrupt officials and human traffickers in her previous career. Derek Morrison was essentially running a psychological warfare campaign against educators, using his privilege as a shield and his intelligence as a weapon. Has anyone ever successfully stood up to him? Margaret shook her head sadly. A few have tried, but Derek always wins in the end. He's patient, strategic, and he has resources most teachers don't. Plus, he's genuinely intelligent, which makes him dangerous. He knows exactly how far he can push before crossing legal lines. The bell rang, signaling the start of the second period. Elsa gathered her materials, thanked Margaret for the warning, and headed toward her classroom with a new understanding of what she was facing. Her second period class was a P English literature, supposedly containing the school's most academically motivated students. As Elsa entered the room, she immediately noticed the changed dynamic. Derek wasn't in this class, but several of his allies were, including Jessica Martinez and Amanda Foster. They sat in the back row with expressions of barely concealed anticipation. "Good morning, everyone," Elsa said, setting her materials on the desk. "Today we're continuing our analysis of Macbeth, focusing specifically on the theme of unchecked ambition and its consequences." Jessica's hand shot up immediately. "Miss Chen, I'm confused about yesterday's assignment. Could you explain again what you want us to focus on in our essays?" It was a reasonable question, but Elsa detected something off about Jessica's tone. Too innocent, too eager. "Of course, Jessica. The assignment asks you to analyze how Shakespeare uses imagery and symbolism to show the psychological deterioration of Macbeth and Lady Macbeth throughout the play." "But that's really subjective, isn't it?" Amanda chimed in. "I mean, how do we know what Shakespeare actually intended? Maybe we're reading meanings into things that aren't really there." Another reasonable question, but coming so quickly after Jessica's, it felt coordinated. Elsa recognized the pattern. They were attempting to undermine her authority by questioning the fundamental premises of literary analysis. "That's an excellent point, Amanda. Literary interpretation does involve some subjectivity, but it's grounded in textual evidence and established analytical frameworks. When we say Shakespeare uses blood imagery to represent guilt, we can point to specific passages where that connection is explicit. But who decided those frameworks were correct?" asked Tyler Chun, no relation to Elsa, one of Derek's football teammates. "I mean, maybe those old professors just made stuff up and everyone started believing it." Now Elsa was certain this was orchestrated. 3 challenging questions in rapid succession, each designed to make her defensive about basic principles of English education. In her former career, she'd encountered similar tactics from hostile contacts, trying to waste time and create confusion during negotiations. "Tyler, that's actually a question that gets to the heart of how knowledge is constructed in any field," Elsa replied calmly. "Literary analysis, like scientific research, builds on previous work. Scholars don't just make things up. They support their interpretations with evidence from the text and from historical context. But how do we know they're not biased?" Jessica pressed. "I mean, most of those professors were probably old white men with their own agendas." Elsa paused, recognizing the sophistication of the attack. Jessica was using progressive language about bias and representation, but in a way designed to undermine the legitimacy of academic study itself. It was actually quite clever, hard to argue against without seeming defensive or regressive. "You're right that perspective matters in interpretation, Jessica. That's why modern literary criticism includes voices from many different backgrounds, and why we encourage students to bring their own analytical skills to the text rather than just accepting others' interpretations." "So basically, any interpretation is as good as any other?" Amanda asked with feigned confusion. "I mean, if it's all subjective anyway, why do we have to follow specific formats for our essays?" The trap was becoming clear. They were trying to get her to either abandon academic standards entirely or to sound elitist and dismissive. Elsa had to admire the tactical thinking, even as she found it frustrating. "Not exactly, Amanda. Think of it like this. If you're arguing a case in court, you can't just state your opinion. You have to provide evidence, follow logical reasoning, and address counterarguments. Literary analysis works the same way." "But court cases have facts," Tyler interjected. "These are just opinions about made-up stories." Elsa felt a flicker of irritation but kept her voice steady. "Tyler, do you think there's no difference between A well-reasoned argument and random speculation? Even when discussing fiction? I'm just saying, maybe we're overthinking things. Maybe Macbeth killed Duncan because he wanted to be king, and all this stuff about psychological symbolism is just teachers trying to make simple stories seem more important than they are. Several students who'd been quietly following the discussion began to nod in agreement. Elsa realized that Derek's allies were successfully swaying the broader class, making her appear to be the one overcomplicating things. That's certainly one way to read the play, Elsa acknowledged. But if that were all Shakespeare intended, why did he include Lady Macbeth's sleepwalking scene? Why the repeated references to blood and sleep? Why show Macbeth's increasingly paranoid behavior? Maybe he just thought it would be dramatic, Jessica suggested with a shrug. Not everything has to have deep meaning. The discussion continued in this vein for another 15 minutes, with Derek's allies taking turns, questioning every aspect of literary analysis while positioning themselves as pragmatic students just trying to understand the assignment. Other students, uncertain about who was right, began to side with the simpler explanations. Elsa found herself in the uncomfortable position of defending the entire concept of academic analysis to a group of students who were pretending to be confused but were actually executing a coordinated assault on her credibility. When the class finally ended, she noticed Jessica and Amanda lingering to pack their bags slowly, clearly hoping to overhear her reaction or catch her in a moment of frustration. Instead, Elsa simply erased the whiteboard and prepared for her next class, maintaining the same calm demeanor she'd cultivated during much more dangerous situations. But she was beginning to understand the scope of what Derek Morrison had orchestrated. This wasn't typical teenage rebellion. It was a sophisticated campaign designed to systematically undermine her authority and effectiveness as a teacher. Third period brought her face to face with Derek himself again, along with Chase and Brett. But now their ranks had swelled. Ryan Peterson sat directly behind Derek, while several other students who'd never shown interest in class participation suddenly seemed eager to engage. "Good morning, Miss Chen," Derek said with exaggerated politeness. "I've been looking forward to continuing yesterday's discussion about character analysis." "Good morning, Derek. I'm glad to hear you're interested in the material." "Oh, I'm very interested. In fact, I was talking to some friends in other classes, and they mentioned you had some fascinating ideas about literary interpretation, something about how there aren't really any right or wrong answers." Elsa immediately recognized what was happening. Derek's network had fed him a distorted version of the morning's discussion, designed to make her previous explanations sound contradictory. "That's not quite accurate, Derek. What I explained was that literary analysis requires evidence and reasoning, just like any other academic discipline. But Jessica Martinez told me you said all interpretations are equally valid as long as they're sincere," Chase jumped in. "So if I think Macbeth is really a story about alien invasion, that's just as good as any professor's opinion, right?" Several students laughed, and Elsa realized she'd walked into a carefully prepared trap. Jessica had deliberately misrepresented her earlier comments, creating ammunition for this moment. "Chase, I think there may have been some miscommunication. Any interpretation needs to be supported by evidence from the text. You couldn't argue for alien invasion because there's nothing in the play to support that reading." "But you said we should bring our own perspectives to the text," Brett added. "What if my perspective includes believing in aliens?" More laughter rippled through the class. Elsa was being made to look foolish, tied up in logical knots by students who were deliberately misunderstanding her explanations. "Brett, personal perspective means considering how your own experiences help you understand universal themes like ambition, guilt, and moral corruption. It doesn't mean ignoring what's actually written in the text." "So there are limits to interpretation?" Derek asked with mock surprise. "But didn't you tell Amanda Foster that old academic frameworks might be biased?" How do we know what limits are legitimate and what limits are just prejudice? The questioning continued relentlessly. Every answer Elsa gave was twisted into ammunition for the next attack. When she tried to maintain academic standards, she was accused of being rigid and elitist. When she acknowledged the complexity of interpretation, she was accused of having no standards at all. Ryan Peterson, who'd never participated in academic discussion before, suddenly became a passionate advocate for practical education. Ms. Chen, I'm just trying to understand how this helps us in real life. I mean, when am I ever going to need to know about blood symbolism in my career? Literature helps develop critical thinking skills, empathy, and communication abilities that are valuable in any career, Elsa replied. But so do lots of things, Ryan pressed. Shouldn't we be learning practical skills instead of spending weeks on one old play? Yeah, agreed another student who'd been recruited to Derek's cause. My dad says English class should teach us how to write resumes and business letters, not how to find hidden meanings in poetry. Elsa found herself defending not just her teaching methods but the entire value of humanities education. Meanwhile, Derek sat back with a satisfied expression, watching his orchestrated campaign unfold exactly as planned. The class period felt endless, with each attempt at actual teaching met by another wave of coordinated questioning and skepticism. By the time the bell rang, Elsa felt mentally exhausted in a way she hadn't experienced since her most challenging intelligence operations. As students filed out, Derek paused at her desk with an expression of fake concern. Miss Chen, I hope you don't mind all the questions. We're just really passionate about understanding the material. I'd hate for anyone to think we were being disrespectful. The words were perfectly chosen, impossible to object to without seeming unreasonable, yet clearly threatening in their implication that he could make things much worse if he chose to. Not at all, Derek. I appreciate students who think critically about what they're learning. Great. I'm sure tomorrow's discussion will be even more engaging. After he left, Elsa sat alone in her classroom, processing what had just happened. Derek Morrison had essentially declared war on her, and his first major offensive had been disturbingly effective. He'd managed to turn routine academic discussion into a coordinated attack on her credibility, all while maintaining plausible deniability. But Derek had made one crucial mistake. He'd assumed she was just another substitute teacher who would crumble under pressure. He had no idea that she'd spent years in environments where the stakes were life and death, where manipulation was a survival skill, and where reading people's true intentions could mean the difference between mission success and international incident. Tomorrow, she decided, it was time to start playing by rules Derek Morrison had never encountered before. The anonymous email arrived in Principal Harris's inbox at 6:47 a.m. on Friday morning, just as he was settling in with his first cup of coffee. The subject line read, "Urgent concerns about substitute teacher, Ms. Chun." By the time he finished reading it, his coffee had gone cold. The email was professionally written, allegedly from a group of concerned parents who had heard troubling reports about Ms. Chun's teaching methods. It accused her of promoting anti-academic attitudes, dismissing traditional educational values, and creating a hostile environment for students who ask legitimate questions. The message included specific quotes that, taken out of context, made Elsa sound like she was encouraging students to ignore established curriculum standards. What made the email particularly effective was its tone of reasonable concern rather than angry accusation. It didn't demand Elsa's immediate dismissal, but suggested that perhaps she needed additional guidance and oversight to ensure she was meeting district standards. The authors claimed they simply wanted what was best for their children's education. Principal Harris had received similar emails before, and he recognized the sophisticated language that suggested legal consultation. This wasn't the work of genuinely concerned parents. This was a calculated move by someone who understood how school district politics worked. His suspicions were confirmed when his secretary buzzed him at 8:15 a.m. Mr. Harris? Richard Morrison is online too. He says it's about his son's English class. Harris sighed deeply before picking up the phone. Richard Morrison, Esquire, was a name that appeared in the district's legal files far too often. Good morning, Mr. Morrison. How can I help you? Good morning, Principal Harris. I hope you've had a chance to review the email that was sent to your office this morning regarding Ms. Chin's teaching practices. I've seen an anonymous email, yes. Though I should mention that the district doesn't typically act on anonymous complaints without. Oh, the email wasn't anonymous, Morrison interrupted smoothly. It was sent by a concerned parents group that includes several families who prefer to handle these matters discreetly to avoid embarrassing the teacher in question. I'm calling as their representative to discuss the situation. Harris felt a familiar headache beginning to form. What exactly are your concerns, Mr. Morrison? From what I understand, Ms. Chun has been dismissive of established academic standards, telling students that all interpretations of literature are equally valid regardless of supporting evidence. She's also reportedly been hostile toward students who ask challenging questions, creating an environment where critical thinking is discouraged. Every word was carefully chosen to sound reasonable while painting Elsa as an incompetent educator. Harris knew that Derek Morrison was likely behind this complaint, but proving it would be nearly impossible. I'll certainly look into these concerns, Harris replied carefully, though I should note that Ms. Chun has received positive feedback from several teachers and students. I'm sure she has, Morrison said in a tone that suggested those positive reviews were somehow suspect. But when multiple families express concerns about a teacher's methods, I think the district has a responsibility to investigate thoroughly. We wouldn't want any misunderstandings to escalate. The implied threat was clear. Morrison was giving the district a chance to handle this quietly before he took more formal action. Meanwhile, Elsa was experiencing the results of Derek's campaign firsthand. Her fourth period class, which had previously been her most engaged group, was now filled with students who seemed determined to waste time with endless procedural questions and skeptical challenges to every aspect of the curriculum. Ms. Chun, asked Brittany Walsh, a student who'd never shown interest in class discussion before this week, why do we have to write our essays in MLA format? My cousin goes to a private school and they use a PAEA format. Isn't it kind of arbitrary to insist on one specific style? It was the fifth procedural question in 10 minutes, each designed to derail the actual lesson and make Elsa appear rigid and unreasonable when she tried to maintain basic academic standards. Different academic disciplines use different citation formats, Elsa explained patiently. In English and literature classes, MLA format is standard because it's designed specifically for humanities research. But that seems really limiting, interjected Kevin Park, another recent recruit to Derek's cause. What if we want to be creative with our formatting? Isn't forcing everyone to use the same style kind of like crushing individual expression? Several students nodded in agreement, and Elsa realized they'd been coached to frame every requirement as an attack on creativity and individual freedom. It was remarkably sophisticated for high school students. Kevin, academic formatting serves the same purpose as traffic laws, Elsa replied. It's not about limiting creativity. It's about creating a common system that allows everyone to communicate effectively. That's a weird comparison, said Ashley Green, who'd transferred into the class just 2 days earlier. I mean, are you saying students who don't follow MLA format are like dangerous drivers? The question was designed to make Elsa's analogy sound ridiculous, and she could see other students beginning to question her explanation. She was being drawn into debates about basic educational practices that should have been non-controversial. Ashley, I'm saying that standardized formats help readers focus on your ideas rather than being distracted by inconsistent presentation. Just like standardized traffic signals help drivers navigate safely. But what if some students learn better with different formats? pressed another student. Isn't it kind of discriminatory to only accept one style? Elsa felt the familiar sensation of being trapped in an endless loop of bad faith questions. Every answer she gave was twisted into evidence of her inflexibility or insensitivity. Meanwhile, the actual lesson on Macbeth remained untaught. The situation reached its climax during the 6th period, Derek's final opportunity to execute his master plan. He'd spent the entire week building toward this moment, recruiting allies, crafting the perfect scenario, and positioning himself as the reasonable student being oppressed by an incompetent substitute teacher. As Elsa began her lesson on the final acts of Macbeth, Derek raised his hand with an expression of earnest confusion. "Miss Chen, I've been thinking about what you said earlier this week about different interpretations being valid, and I'm really struggling with the assignment." Elsa immediately sensed danger. Derek's tone was too polite, too concerned. "What specifically are you struggling with, Derek?" "Well, you keep talking about Macbeth's guilt and psychological deterioration, but what if I don't see it that way? What if I think Macbeth is actually the hero of the story, a strong leader who takes decisive action to claim what's rightfully his?" It was a deliberately provocative interpretation, designed to force Elsa into either accepting an obviously wrong reading or appearing to contradict her earlier statements about valid interpretation. "That's an interesting perspective, Derek. How would you support that interpretation using evidence from the text?" "Well, Macbeth shows leadership qualities. He's brave in battle, he's decisive, and he doesn't let other people's opinions stop him from achieving his goals. Maybe Shakespeare was actually criticizing people who are too weak to take what they want." Several students shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Derek's interpretation was clearly wrong, but he was presenting it with such confidence that some were beginning to doubt their own understanding. "Derek, how would you account for the way Shakespeare portrays the consequences of Macbeth's actions? The breakdown of his marriage, the paranoia, the increasing violence? Maybe those aren't supposed to be negative consequences," Derek replied smoothly. "Maybe they're just the natural price of leadership. Strong leaders have to make tough decisions that weak people can't understand." Chase picked up the thread seamlessly. "Yeah, and all the characters who criticize Macbeth are either his enemies or people who benefit from the old system. Maybe Shakespeare was showing how people resist change even when it's necessary." Brett nodded enthusiastically. "Right. And Lady Macbeth's breakdown could just show that women aren't strong enough to handle the realities of power. That's not sexist. It's just a biological fact." Elsa felt her patience finally beginning to crack. Derek and his friends weren't just promoting a bad interpretation. They were using the classroom to advance genuinely harmful ideas about leadership, gender, and power. And they were doing it while hiding behind academic discussion. "Brett, that interpretation ignores substantial evidence in the text and makes assumptions about gender that aren't supported by—" "But you said we should bring our own perspectives to literature," Derek interrupted. "This is our perspective. Are you saying our viewpoint isn't valid because it doesn't match what you want us to think?" The trap was perfectly constructed. If Elsa rejected their interpretation, she appeared to be contradicting her own teaching about multiple perspectives. If she accepted it, she was endorsing ideas that were both academically wrong and morally problematic. Ryan Peterson decided to escalate further. "Miss Chun, it kind of seems like you only want us to have perspectives that agree with your political beliefs. Isn't that kind of indoctrination rather than education?" A murmur ran through the classroom. Ryan had introduced the word indoctrination, a loaded term that immediately politicized the entire discussion. "Ryan, I'm not promoting any political agenda. I'm asking you to support your interpretations with textual evidence and logical reasoning." "But you immediately dismissed our interpretation," Derek said with feigned hurt. "You didn't even consider that we might have valid points. That doesn't seem very open-minded." Amanda Foster, who'd been waiting for her cue, jumped in from across the room. "This is exactly what my dad warned me about. Teachers who claim to support different perspectives, but only accept the ones that match their own ideology." "Yeah," agreed Jessica Martinez. "I thought college prep classes were supposed to teach us to think critically, not just memorize what the teacher believes." Elsa realized she was being systematically surrounded. Every student speaking up had been carefully positioned to make her appear close-minded and politically biased. Meanwhile, students who might have disagreed were staying silent, intimidated by the coordinated nature of the attack. "I'm not asking you to memorize anything," Elsa said, fighting to keep her voice level. "I'm asking you to engage with the text honestly and support your claims with evidence." "But what counts as evidence?" Derek asked with mock innocence. "Earlier you said academic frameworks might be biased. So how do we know which evidence is legitimate and which evidence is just prejudice?" He was using her own words against her, twisting her nuanced explanation about the complexity of interpretation into ammunition for his attack. Elsa felt the familiar surge of anger she'd experienced when dealing with corrupt officials who used legal technicalities to justify harmful behavior. "Derek, intellectual honesty means acknowledging when textual evidence contradicts your preferred interpretation. It means being willing to change your mind when presented with compelling arguments." "So you're saying we should change our minds to match your interpretation?" Chase asked with exaggerated confusion. "That doesn't sound very intellectually honest." "I'm saying you should engage with the actual text instead of imposing predetermined conclusions." "But isn't your interpretation also predetermined?" Brecht pressed. "I mean, you're using the same professors and critics you were taught to use. How is that different from us using our own reasoning?" The circular logic was maddening. Every principle of academic discourse was being twisted into evidence of bias and close-mindedness. Elsa was being made to defend the fundamental concepts of education itself. Tyler Chun raised his hand with an expression of genuine confusion. "Miss Chun, I'm really lost now. Are you saying there are right and wrong answers in English class or not? Because you keep switching between saying all perspectives are valid and saying our perspectives are wrong." The question revealed the effectiveness of Derek's strategy. By forcing Elsa to navigate between seemingly contradictory positions, he'd created genuine confusion among students who weren't part of his campaign. "Tyler, I'm saying that valid perspectives must be supported by evidence from the text and logical reasoning. You can't simply assert any interpretation and expect it to be taken seriously." "But who decides what counts as logical reasoning?" Jessica asked. "I mean, isn't logic itself kind of culturally biased? My sociology teacher says that Western logic systems aren't necessarily better than other ways of thinking." Elsa felt trapped in an academic house of mirrors, where every concept she tried to use was immediately relativized and undermined. Derek's group had clearly been coached, not just in what to say, but in how to weaponize progressive academic language against traditional educational standards. "Jessica, while different cultures may have different ways of approaching knowledge, academic analysis requires certain shared standards of evidence and reasoning." "That sounds pretty ethnocentric," Ryan said with false concern. "Are you saying non-Western ways of thinking aren't good enough for your class?" The accusation of ethnocentrism hit Elsa like a physical blow. As a Chinese-American woman, she was being accused of cultural bias by students who were deliberately misrepresenting her attempts to maintain basic academic standards. "Ryan, that's not what I said, and you know it. But it's what you implied," Derek said with mock sadness. "Look, Ms. Chun, we're not trying to be difficult. We're just confused about what you actually want from us." He stood up slowly, his expression carefully crafted to suggest reluctant disappointment rather than aggression. "Maybe this is just a fundamental mismatch. You want us to think a certain way about literature, and we want to think for ourselves. There's nothing wrong with either approach, but maybe you'd be happier teaching students who are more compliant. The word compliant hung in the air like an accusation. Derek was positioning himself as a champion of independent thinking being oppressed by an authoritarian teacher. Chase and Brett stood up as well, followed by Ryan, Jessica, and Amanda. Within moments, half the class was on their feet in what appeared to be a spontaneous display of solidarity with Derek's independent thinking. "Where are you going?" Elsa asked, though she already knew the answer. "We're exercising our right to seek educational environments that encourage rather than suppress critical thinking," Derek replied formally. "We'll be in the library, engaging in actual academic discussion about Macbeth." As they filed out of the classroom, Derek paused at the door. "Miss Chun, I hope you understand this isn't personal. We just believe education should be about expanding minds, not controlling them." The remaining students sat in stunned silence, unsure whether they should follow their classmates or stay with their teacher. Several looked torn between loyalty to authority and the appeal of joining what looked like a principled stand against unfairness. Elsa stood alone at the front of the nearly empty classroom, feeling more isolated and frustrated than she had since her worst days in the field. Derek Morrison had just executed a perfect textbook operation. He'd goaded her into appearing unreasonable, recruited witnesses to his victimization, and positioned himself as a principled advocate for academic freedom, but he'd also just made his biggest mistake. Derek had assumed he was dealing with a typical substitute teacher who would either break down or escalate inappropriately. He had no idea that Elsa Chun had spent years dealing with people far more dangerous and manipulative than him. And unlike her previous targets, Derek Morrison was about to learn that there were consequences for psychological warfare against the wrong opponent. As the bell rang and the remaining students quietly gathered their belongings, Elsa stood perfectly still, her mind already working out a response that Derek would never see coming. The game was about to change completely. That afternoon, as Derek Morrison basked in the glow of his successful walkout, he had no idea that Elsa Chun was sitting in the school library conducting research that would change everything. But this wasn't literary research. This was the kind of intelligence gathering she'd perfected during 12 years with the CIA, using the school's computer system and her still active security clearances. Elsa began building comprehensive profiles on Derek and his inner circle. What she discovered in the next 2 hours would have impressed her former colleagues at Langley. Derek Morrison wasn't just a privileged teenager acting out. He was following a pattern of behavior that had been carefully cultivated by his father, Richard Morrison, Esquire. Court records showed that Richard had used similar tactics throughout his legal career. Systematic campaigns of pressure designed to make opponents surrender rather than fight. The apple, as they say, hadn't fallen far from the tree. Derek's social media presence revealed a sophisticated understanding of manipulation tactics. His Instagram account showed him with various groups of students, but Elsa noticed the pattern in the photos. Derek was always positioned as the central figure, with others arranged around him in ways that suggested deference. His captions were carefully crafted to project an image of natural leadership, while subtly diminishing others. More telling were the digital breadcrumbs Elsa found in the school's own systems. Derek had been involved in the departure of 3 teachers over the past 2 years, always using this same playbook: recruit allies, create documentation of problematic behavior, apply pressure through parental complaints, and finally execute. A dramatic gesture that positioned him as the victim. Mrs. Campbell, the previous substitute, hadn't suffered a random nervous breakdown. She'd been systematically destroyed by a campaign that included fake parent complaints, manipulated classroom recordings, and social media harassment orchestrated by Derek's network. The pattern was unmistakable once you knew what to look for. But Derek had made one crucial error. He'd assumed Elsa was just another educator who would crumble under pressure. He had no idea that she'd spent years in environments where reading people's true intentions was a matter of life and death. As Elsa reviewed security footage from the hallway cameras, she noticed something Derek probably thought was invisible. Before each of his major classroom disruptions, there were brief conversations with specific students in the hallways. The conversations appeared casual, but the timing was too precise to be coincidental. Derek was giving instructions, coordinating his attacks with military-level precision. The final piece of the puzzle came from an unexpected source. Emma Rodriguez, a quiet sophomore who'd been one of Derek's earlier targets, approached Elsa as she was packing up her research. "Ms. Chun, can I talk to you for a minute?" Emma looked nervous, constantly glancing around as if expecting Derek to materialize from the shadows. "I heard about what happened in your class today, with the walkout and everything. What about it?" "Emma, I just I wanted you to know that Derek planned the whole thing. He's been talking about it all week. He calls it Operation Substitute Breakdown. He did the same thing to Mrs. Campbell last semester." Emma's voice dropped to a whisper. "He has this whole group that follows him around. They call themselves the Truth Squad, but really they just target teachers Derek doesn't like. They coordinate their questions. They get their parents to complain. They even make fake social media accounts to spread rumors." Elsa felt a cold anger settling in her chest. "Emma, why are you telling me this?" "Because Derek destroyed Mrs. Campbell for no reason, except that she tried to make him follow the same rules as everyone else. She was actually a really good teacher, but he made everyone think she was crazy, and now he's doing it to you." Emma pulled out her phone and showed Elsa a group chat called Truth Squad Operations. The messages revealed the full scope of Derek's campaign: assigned talking points for classroom disruptions, templates for parent complaint emails, and even instructions on how to record classroom interactions out of context. "How did you get access to this?" Elsa asked. "My boyfriend used to be friends with Brett Collins before Derek recruited him. Brett showed him the chat thinking it was funny. My boyfriend thought it was messed up and screenshot everything before Derek kicked him out of the group." The evidence was damning. Derek hadn't just been disrupting classes, he'd been running a sophisticated psychological operation designed to destroy teachers' careers and reputations. The level of planning and coordination would have been impressive if it weren't so malicious. "Emma, would you be willing to share this information with the administration?" Emma's face went pale. "I can't. Derek would destroy me. You don't understand what he's capable of. He's already spreading rumors about me dating someone he doesn't approve of. If he knew I was helping you." Elsa understood. Derek had created a climate of fear where students were afraid to speak out against him. It was a classic authoritarian tactic: make resistance seem more dangerous than compliance. "Don't worry, Emma. You've given me what I need." Derek Morrison is about to learn that he picked the wrong target. That evening, Elsa sat in her apartment reviewing everything she'd learned. Derek's operation was sophisticated, but it had one fatal flaw. It relied on his targets being isolated and powerless. He'd never faced someone who understood his tactics and had the skills to counter them. In her former career, Elsa had dealt with much more dangerous adversaries than a privileged teenager. Arms dealers, terrorist financiers, corrupt government officials, all of them had tried to use manipulation, pressure, and intimidation to achieve their goals. Derek Morrison was using the same playbook, just in a high school setting. The next morning brought a surprise. Principal Harris called Elsa into his office before the first period, his expression carefully neutral. "Ms. Chun, I wanted to discuss yesterday's incident with the walkout. I've received several calls from concerned parents." Elsa had expected this. Derek's network would have spent the evening crafting their narrative, painting her as an unstable teacher who'd driven students out of her classroom. "What specifically are their concerns, Mr. Harris?" "They're saying you created a hostile environment, for students who asked legitimate questions about the curriculum. There are claims that you became defensive and accusatory when students tried to engage in academic discussion. Harris pulled out a printed email. I have a formal complaint here from Richard Morrison on behalf of several families. He's requesting that we conduct a formal review of your teaching methods and classroom management. Elsa remained calm, her voice steady. Mr. Harris, I'd like to share some information with you that might provide additional context for these complaints. She handed him a folder containing printouts of the Truth Squad operations chat, along with her analysis of the pattern of complaints against previous teachers. Harris's expression changed as he read through the evidence. Where did you get this? A concerned student shared it with me. As you can see, yesterday's walkout wasn't a spontaneous reaction to poor teaching. It was a coordinated operation designed to create exactly the narrative you're hearing from parents. Harris studied the evidence more carefully. The chat logs were damning, showing clear premeditation and coordination. There were even messages discussing how to manipulate classroom recordings and coach parents on what complaints to make. This is concerning, Harris said slowly. But I'm not sure how we can act on information obtained from private group chats. You don't need to act on the chats themselves, Elsa replied. But you can observe the pattern. Derek Morrison has been involved in the departure of 3 teachers using identical tactics. That's not a coincidence. That's a systematic campaign. Harris looked uncomfortable. Ms. Chen, I understand your frustration, but Derek's father is, well, he's made it clear that any action against his son needs to be carefully considered. Mr. Harris, with respect, Richard Morrison is using his son as a proxy to intimidate educators. If you don't address this pattern, it will continue. Derek will keep targeting teachers until someone stops him. What are you suggesting? Elsa leaned forward slightly. I'm suggesting you let me handle Derek Morrison. Handle him how? By teaching him that actions have consequences. By showing him that not everyone will be intimidated by his psychological warfare tactics. Harris looked alarmed. Ms. Chen, I can't authorize any kind of retaliation. I'm not talking about retaliation. I'm talking about education. Derek Morrison is about to learn some lessons that apparently his father never taught him. That afternoon, as Derek prepared for what he expected would be Elsa's final day at Lincoln Valley High, he had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. The Truth Squad gathered in the hallway before 6th period, confident that their teacher would either be absent, having quit in humiliation, or completely broken by the pressure they'd applied. I heard she had a meeting with Harris this morning, Jessica reported. My mom's friend works in the office and said Chun looked really upset when she left. Derek smiled with satisfaction. Phase 1 complete. By tomorrow, we'll have a new substitute who understands how things work around here. They entered the classroom expecting to find either a broken woman or an empty room. Instead, they found Elsa Chun standing calmly at the front of the class, with something new in her demeanor. She looked different. More focused, more present. Good afternoon, everyone, Elsa said as students took their seats. Today we're going to try something different. Instead of discussing Macbeth, we're going to talk about power, manipulation, and the psychology of bullying. Derek felt a flicker of unease. This wasn't the reaction he'd expected. We're going to examine how certain individuals use systematic campaigns of psychological pressure to control others. Elsa continued. We'll look at the tactics they use, the patterns they follow, and most importantly, how their targets can recognize and counter these attacks. The classroom had gone completely silent. Several students were looking nervously at Derek, sensing that something significant was happening. For example, Elsa said, walking slowly around the room, a typical psychological manipulation campaign might begin with the aggressor identifying what they perceive as weakness in their target. They might choose someone new to an environment, someone without established support networks. Derek's unease was growing into genuine concern. It felt like Elsa was describing his exact playbook. The aggressor would then recruit allies, often by appealing to their desire for social status, or by offering them protection from becoming targets themselves. They would coordinate their attacks, making them appear spontaneous while following a carefully planned strategy. Chase and Brett were staring at their desks, unwilling to make eye contact with anyone. Other students were beginning to understand what they were hearing. The attacks would escalate gradually, Elsa continued, her voice taking on a lecturing tone that was somehow more intimidating than anger. Starting with minor provocations, then building to more serious challenges to the target's authority or competence. The goal would be to make the target appear unstable or incompetent, while positioning the aggressor as reasonable and concerned. Derek finally found his voice. "Miss Chun, this is supposed to be an English class. Why are we talking about psychology?" Elsa turned to face him directly, and Derek felt something cold settle in his stomach. Her expression was perfectly calm, but there was something in her eyes that he'd never seen before. "Derek, I'm glad you asked. You see, understanding manipulation tactics is actually very relevant to literature. Many of Shakespeare's villains use similar strategies. Iago in Othello, for instance, systematically destroys his targets through carefully orchestrated campaigns of psychological warfare." She paused, letting the comparison sink in. Of course, the difference between fictional villains and real life manipulators is that real manipulators eventually face consequences for their actions. The temperature in the room seemed to have dropped 10 degrees. Derek realized that somehow, impossibly, his mild-mannered substitute teacher had figured out exactly what he'd been doing. "Now then," Elsa said, returning to the front of the class, "let's discuss what happens when these manipulation campaigns encounter someone who actually understands them." Derek Morrison was about to discover that his days as the untouchable king of Lincoln Valley High were over, and Elsa Chun was just getting started. The silence in the classroom was deafening as Elsa Chun pulled down a projection screen and connected her laptop to the smartboard. Derek Morrison felt his mouth go dry as he realized she was about to show the class something that would change everything. "Class, I want to share with you a case study in psychological manipulation," Elsa began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had interrogated international criminals. "This is a real-time example of how systematic campaigns of intimidation work, and more importantly, how they can be dismantled." The first slide appeared on the screen, a timeline showing the departure dates of Mrs. Campbell, Mr. Rodriguez from the previous year, and Miss Patterson before her illness. Each departure was marked with documented incidents that preceded it. "Notice the pattern," Elsa said, using a laser pointer to highlight specific dates. Each educator who left Lincoln Valley High experienced a similar sequence of events. First, coordinated classroom disruptions. Then parent complaints follow identical templates. Finally, a dramatic incident that made the teacher appear unstable or incompetent. Several students were leaning forward in their seats, fascinated despite themselves. Derek tried to maintain his composure, but sweat was beginning to form on his forehead. "The next slide shows the communication patterns behind these campaigns," Elsa continued, displaying a network diagram that showed message timestamps from the Truth Squad chat logs, with names anonymized but patterns clearly visible. As you can see, the disruptions weren't spontaneous. They were coordinated through digital communications, with specific students assigned particular roles and talking points. The coordination was sophisticated enough to include backup plans and alternative strategies if initial approaches failed. Chase Williams was staring at the screen in horror, recognizing his own message patterns in the anonymized data. Brett Collins had gone completely pale, slumping in his seat as if trying to disappear. "But here's what makes this case study particularly interesting," Elsa said, advancing to the next slide. "The orchestrator of these campaigns made a fundamental miscalculation. They assumed their target would be isolated, uninformed, and lacking in resources to mount an effective defense. Derek finally found his voice, though it came out shakier than he intended. "Ms. Chen, I don't know what you're trying to prove with this presentation, but you can't just accuse students of conspiracy without evidence." Elsa turned to face him with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Derek, you're absolutely right. Accusations without evidence would be inappropriate. That's why everything I'm showing the class is documented fact, obtained through legitimate channels." She clicked to the next slide, which showed a photograph of Derek's father, Richard Morrison, with a caption listing his successful lawsuits against educational institutions. It's also worth noting that this pattern of behavior appears to be learned rather than innate. When children grow up watching systematic intimidation used as a tool for getting desired outcomes, they often adopt similar strategies. Derek felt a flush of anger mixing with his growing panic. She was attacking his father now, bringing family dynamics into a classroom setting. "You can't talk about my family in class. That's completely inappropriate." Actually, Derek, discussing the sociological factors that contribute to bullying behavior is entirely appropriate in an educational setting, Elsa replied calmly, especially when that behavior is actively disrupting the learning environment for other students. She advanced to a slide showing statistics about workplace bullying and its long-term effects on victims. The impact of systematic intimidation campaigns extends far beyond their immediate targets. They create climates of fear where bystanders become afraid to speak up, enabling the behavior to continue unchecked. Emma Rodriguez, sitting in the front row, felt a surge of courage as she recognized the truth in Elsa's words. "That's exactly what happens here," she said, her voice barely above a whisper but audible in the silent classroom. "People are afraid to say anything because they don't want to become targets." Derek spun around to glare at Emma, his mask of reasonable concern finally slipping. "Emma, you don't know what you're talking about. Nobody's afraid of anything. Some people just can't handle honest discussion." "Interesting choice of words, Derek," Elsa interjected. "Honest discussion is quite different from coordinated psychological warfare. Would you like me to explain the difference?" Before Derek could respond, Elsa clicked a slide showing key differences between legitimate academic debate and manipulative interrogation tactics. The parallels to Derek's classroom behavior were unmistakable. Honest discussion involves good faith engagement with ideas, Elsa explained. Participants acknowledge when they've been presented with compelling counter-evidence. They focus on understanding rather than winning. Most importantly, they treat their discussion partners with basic respect. She paused, letting the comparison sink in. Manipulative interrogation, on the other hand, involves predetermined conclusions, circular logic designed to trap opponents, and personal attacks disguised as academic inquiry. Tyler Chen, who had been genuinely confused by the previous week's debates, suddenly understood what had been happening. "So when we were asking all those questions about interpretation and bias, we weren't actually discussing literature?" "Some of you were engaged in legitimate discussion, Tyler," Elsa replied. "But others were following a script designed to waste time and create confusion. The goal wasn't to understand Macbeth better, it was to make me appear incompetent." Derek realized he was losing control of the narrative completely. His allies were either silent or beginning to look ashamed, while other students were starting to understand how they'd been manipulated. "This is ridiculous," Derek said, standing up abruptly. "You're the teacher who couldn't handle a few challenging questions, so now you're creating conspiracy theories to make yourself feel better. This whole presentation is just you being vindictive because students didn't automatically respect your authority." Elsa remained perfectly calm in the face of Derek's outburst. "Derek, thank you for providing such a clear example of deflection and projection. Class, notice how the response to documented evidence is to attack the messenger rather than address the substance of the claims." She clicked to the next slide, which showed common defensive tactics used by manipulators when confronted. Derek's response matched the pattern exactly. Also noticed the attempt to reframe systematic harassment as challenging questions, and documented evidence as conspiracy theories. This is a classic technique called gaslighting, making victims question their own perception of reality. Several students were now looking at Derek with new understanding. Jessica Martinez, who had been one of his most loyal followers, was staring at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. "Derek," she said slowly, "did you really plan all those discussions? Were you telling us what to say in class?" Derek felt his social network beginning to crumble in real time. "Jess, you know that's not how it happened. We were just talking about our genuine concerns about her teaching methods." "But you did have us coordinate our questions," Chase admitted reluctantly. "I mean, you said it was just to make sure we covered all the important points, but—" "Chase, shut up!" Derek snapped, his composure finally breaking completely. The mask of reasonable concern was gone, replaced by the ugly reality of someone losing control. Elsa seized the moment. "And there it is, class. When manipulation tactics fail, manipulators often resort to direct intimidation." Derek just demonstrated exactly what I've been describing. The transformation in the classroom dynamic was visible. Students who had been afraid to speak against Derek were now looking at him with a mixture of disgust and pity. His empire of fear was collapsing in real time. "You want to know what's really interesting about this case study?" Elsa continued, advancing to her final slide. "The person orchestrating these campaigns assumed their target was just another vulnerable educator. They had no idea they were dealing with someone with extensive training in counterintelligence and psychological operations." Derek felt the blood drain from his face. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about 12 years with the Central Intelligence Agency. Derek, 12 years dealing with people far more sophisticated and dangerous than a privileged teenager who learned manipulation tactics from his father's legal practice." The classroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Several students pulled out their phones, probably to search for information about their substitute teacher, who had just revealed herself to be a former CIA operative. "In my previous career, I dealt with arms dealers who used psychological pressure to intimidate government officials. I interrogated human traffickers who were experts at manipulation and control. I've sat across from people who could literally have me killed if they discovered my true identity." Elsa's voice remained calm, but there was steel underneath that made even Derek's supporters shrink back in their seats. "So when a 17-year-old boy with daddy issues tries to use amateur psychological warfare against me, well, it's almost amusing." Derek was staring at her in shock, finally understanding the magnitude of his miscalculation. He'd been playing checkers while she'd been playing chess, and the game had been over before he'd even realized it had begun. "The good news," Elsa continued, "is that this has been an excellent educational opportunity for everyone. You've all witnessed how manipulation campaigns work, how they can be identified and countered, and what happens when manipulators encounter someone who understands their tactics." She clicked off the projector and faced the class directly. "Derek, I want you to understand something. In my former career, I had to make split-second decisions that could affect national security. I've been in situations where reading people correctly was the difference between life and death. Compared to those experiences, dealing with your little campaign of harassment has been remarkably straightforward." Derek opened his mouth to respond, but nothing came out. For the first time in his high school career, he was completely speechless. "However," Elsa continued, "I want you all to learn something important from this experience. Derek's behavior wasn't evil, it was learned. He grew up watching systematic intimidation being used as a tool for getting desired outcomes. He simply applied those lessons in a school setting." She looked directly at Derek, and for a moment her expression softened slightly. "Derek, you're clearly intelligent and capable of leadership. But you've been using those abilities to tear people down rather than build them up. That's not strength. It's cowardice disguised as power. The classroom was dead silent. Even Derek's most loyal followers were looking at him with something approaching pity. "Here's what's going to happen," Elsa said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had commanded respect in much more dangerous situations. "Derek, you're going to personally apologize to every teacher you've targeted with these campaigns. You're going to write a detailed explanation of your methods and submit it to Principal Harris, along with a plan for making amends to the educators whose careers you've damaged." Derek finally found his voice. "You can't make me do anything." "My father will." "Your father will do exactly nothing," Elsa interrupted, her voice cutting through his protest like a blade. "Because I've already spoken with the district's legal counsel about the evidence I've gathered. Your father's intimidation tactics work against people who are afraid of lawsuits. I'm not afraid of your father, Derek. I've dealt with actual threats." She paused, letting the implications sink in. "Moreover, the evidence of your systematic harassment campaigns is now documented in official school records. If your father chooses to pursue legal action, it will only draw more attention to behavior that could result in criminal charges under anti-bullying statutes." Derek felt his world crumbling around him. His father's legal shield, which had always protected him from consequences, was useless against someone who not only understood the law but had no fear of Richard Morrison's threats. "But here's the most important lesson," Elsa said, addressing the entire class. "None of this had to happen. Derek could have used his intelligence and leadership abilities to help other students, to contribute positively to the school community, to prepare himself for a future where he builds things rather than destroys them." She looked back at Derek, whose arrogance had been completely replaced by something approaching shame. "Derek, you have a choice to make. You can continue down the path your father has shown you, using intimidation and legal threats to get your way. Or you can choose to be better than that." The bell rang, but nobody moved. The entire class sat transfixed by what they'd witnessed, the complete dismantling of Derek Morrison's reign of terror by a substitute teacher, who turned out to be far more than she'd appeared. As students slowly began to gather their belongings, Derek remained frozen in his seat, staring at his hands. His empire of fear had crumbled in a single class period, destroyed by someone who understood his tactics better than he understood them himself. Jessica Martinez approached Elsa's desk. As other students filed out, "Miss Chun, I want to apologize for my part in all this. I didn't realize what Derek was really doing until today." "Jessica, recognizing manipulation when you're caught up in it is difficult," Elsa replied kindly. "The important thing is that you've learned to identify it now. That knowledge will serve you well in the future." One by one, several of Derek's former followers approached to apologize, each expressing shock at discovering the coordinated nature of what they'd thought were spontaneous discussions. Derek finally stood up to leave, but Elsa called his name. "Derek, I meant what I said about having a choice. You're clearly capable of great things. The question is whether you'll use your abilities to help people or hurt them." Derek paused at the doorway, his back still turned. "My father's going to be furious when he finds out what happened today." "Derek, your father's opinion isn't the only one that matters. You're 17 years old. You still have time to decide what kind of person you want to be." For a moment, Derek looked like he might respond. Then he walked out of the classroom, leaving Elsa alone with the knowledge that Lincoln Valley High would be a very different place starting tomorrow. That the untouchable king had fallen, and Elsa Chun had barely broken a sweat. 3 weeks after Elsa Chun's devastating revelation, Lincoln Valley High was a fundamentally different place. The hallways that had once buzzed with whispered fear about Derek Morrison's latest target now carried conversations about college applications, upcoming games, and normal teenage concerns. It was as if a dark cloud had lifted from the entire School. Principal Harris sat in his office reviewing the formal report Elsa had submitted about the systematic harassment campaigns. The document was 47 pages long, meticulously researched, and devastating in its thoroughness. It included everything from the Truth Squad chat logs to psychological profiles of manipulation tactics, cross-referenced with academic studies. On institutional bullying. "I have to admit," Harris said to Elsa during their follow-up meeting, "I've never seen anything quite like this. You've essentially conducted a professional intelligence operation within our school." Elsa adjusted her glasses, having returned to her mild-mannered substitute teacher persona, though everyone now knew what lay beneath the surface. The techniques are the same whether you're dealing with international criminals or high school bullies. The stakes are just different. What's remarkable is how quickly everything changed once Derek's network was exposed. "We've had more students report previous incidents in the past 3 weeks than in the previous 3 years combined." It was true. Emma Rodriguez had started a support group for students who'd been targeted by Derek's campaigns, and they were discovering that his influence had been far more extensive than anyone had realized. Freshmen who'd been afraid to eat lunch in the cafeteria were suddenly finding their voices. Teachers who'd been walking on eggshells around certain students were rediscovering their authority. "Fear is a powerful tool," Elsa replied. "But it only works when people believe the person wielding it is untouchable." Once Derek's mystique was shattered, his entire power structure collapsed. Harris nodded, then looked uncomfortable. "I have to ask, what's going to happen with the Morrison family?" "Richard Morrison has been surprisingly quiet since all this came to light." Elsa's smile was slight but satisfied. Mr. Morrison received a very detailed explanation of what his son had been doing, along with copies of all the evidence. He also received some information about the legal consequences of systematic harassment campaigns, particularly when they target educators. "From our legal counsel?" "From my former colleagues at the Justice Department." Turns out that using intimidation tactics to interfere with educational institutions can fall under federal jurisdiction in certain circumstances. Mr. Morrison is a smart lawyer. He understands the implications. Harris winced. Richard Morrison had built his career on being the aggressor in legal battles, the one making threats and forcing settlements. Finding himself on the defensive against federal investigators was undoubtedly a humbling experience. And Derek himself? Elsa's expression grew more thoughtful. "Derek is complicated. He submitted the apology letters I requested, along with a detailed account of his methods. The writing quality was excellent. He has genuine talent when he applies himself constructively." She pulled out a folder from her bag. "More importantly, he's been attending the counseling sessions I recommended. Apparently, he's starting to understand how his father's approach to conflict has shaped his own behavior." The transformation in Derek Morrison had been one of the most surprising aspects of the entire affair. After his initial shock and anger, he'd seemed to undergo a genuine period of self-reflection. His former followers reported that he'd stopped his usual pattern of finding new targets, instead spending most of his time alone or in conversations with the school counselor. "Has he approached any of his previous victims?" "Several." Mrs. Campbell was particularly gracious when he called to apologize. She's actually considering returning to teaching because of his conversation with her. Meanwhile, in the school library, Derek Morrison sat across from Emma Rodriguez in what had become a weekly ritual. Emma had initially been terrified when Derek asked to speak with her, but his demeanor was so completely different from his previous incarnation that curiosity had overcome fear. "I keep thinking about what Miss Chun said," Derek was telling her, "about how I learned these behaviors from watching my father. I never really thought about it before, but she was right." Emma studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda. But Derek seemed genuinely different, smaller somehow, more human than the untouchable figure he'd projected before. What do you mean? Growing up, whenever my dad faced any opposition, he'd research his opponents, find their weaknesses, and systematically destroy them. He called it strategic advantage. I thought it was just how successful people operated. Derek stared at his hands, which had once gestured arrogantly as he commanded his followers. I applied the same approach to school. Find the teachers who seemed vulnerable, exploit their weaknesses, recruit allies to make it seem justified. I thought I was being clever. What changed your mind? Meeting someone who actually understood what I was doing and could counter it completely. Ms. Chun didn't get angry or emotional like I expected. She just analyzed my tactics and dismantled them systematically. It was like watching a master chess player defeat a child. Emma felt a strange mixture of sympathy and residual fear. Derek's reign of terror had made her junior year miserable. But seeing him this vulnerable was almost unsettling. Are you going to keep going to counseling? Derek nodded. Dr. Martinez has been helping me understand the difference between leadership and domination. Apparently, real leaders build people up instead of tearing them down. Who knew? His attempt at humor was awkward, but Emma could see he was trying to change. What about your dad? Is he okay with you going to therapy? Derek's expression darkened. Slightly. My father is dealing with some consequences of his own approach to conflict resolution. Turns out that threatening people only works when they're afraid of you. Miss Chun connected him with some federal investigators who were very interested in his methods. Is he in trouble? Nothing criminal, but his reputation has taken a hit. Several clients have dropped him after learning about his intimidation tactics. Apparently, most people prefer lawyers who solve problems rather than create them. The irony wasn't lost on Derek. His father's aggressive approach, which had always seemed so powerful and effective, had finally encountered someone who couldn't be intimidated. The resulting damage to Richard Morrison's practice was serving as an object lesson in the long-term costs of bullying behavior. Across the library, Tyler Chun was having his own revelation. He'd approached Elsa after class earlier that week with a question that had been bothering him since her dramatic revelation. Ms. Chun, can I ask you something personal? Of course, Tyler. When you were working for the CIA, did you ever have to do things you weren't proud of? Elsa had paused, considering how to answer honestly while remaining appropriate for a student conversation. Tyler, intelligence work sometimes requires difficult choices. But the goal was always to protect people and prevent larger conflicts. The methods Derek was using had no constructive purpose. They were just about exercising power over others. But you used psychological tactics against Derek. How is that different? It was a perceptive question, and Elsa had respected Tyler for asking it. The difference is proportionality and purpose. Tyler, Derek was systematically harming innocent people for his own gratification. I used the minimum force necessary to stop that harm and hopefully redirect his behavior towards something constructive. So, it's about why you're doing it. Partly. But it's also about what happens afterward. Derek had been escalating his campaigns, targeting more teachers and students. If I hadn't stopped him, the damage would have continued to spread. Sometimes intervention is necessary to prevent greater harm. Tyler nodded thoughtfully. Like how? Sometimes you have to fight bullies to make them stop. Sometimes. But the goal should always be to stop the harmful behavior, not to become a bully yourself. Derek is learning that difference now. Indeed, Derek's transformation had become one of the most closely watched developments at Lincoln Valley. Students who had feared him were gradually beginning to see him as something, approaching a normal teenager rather than an untouchable predator. The change was most visible in his interactions with younger students. Where he had once identified potential victims, Derek now seemed to go out of his way to help kids who were struggling with social dynamics or academic pressures. It was as if he was trying to atone for his previous behavior by using his social intelligence constructively. It's weird. Jessica Martinez confided to her friends during lunch. Derek actually helped my little brother with some kids who were picking on him. He didn't threaten anyone or make a big scene. He just talked to them and somehow made it stop. Maybe Ms. Chun was right about him having leadership potential, suggested Amanda Foster, who had done considerable soul-searching of her own. After realizing how she'd been manipulated, the ripple effects of Derek's downfall had touched every aspect of school culture. Teachers reported that classroom discussions had become more genuine and productive, with students engaging in actual debate rather than coordinated disruption. The Guidance Counseling Office had seen a surge of students seeking help for anxiety and social issues they'd previously been afraid to discuss. Most significantly, other potential bullies had taken note of what happened to someone who had seemed untouchable. The message was clear: systematic harassment wouldn't be tolerated, and the school now had people capable of identifying and countering such behavior. Mrs. Patterson returned from her illness to find her classes dramatically improved. "It's like someone lifted a curse," she told Margaret Stevens in the faculty lounge. "The students are actually excited about learning again." "Elsa Chun happened," Margaret replied. "Best substitute teacher we've ever had. The district is trying to convince her to take a permanent position. Is she considering it? I think she's found her calling. Turns out that skills you learn fighting international criminals transfer quite well to education." As spring arrived at Lincoln Valley High, Elsa reflected on her accidental career change during a quiet moment in her classroom. She'd come to education seeking peace and purpose after her intense CIA career, but she'd discovered that schools had their own forms of warfare requiring similar skills. A knock on her doorframe interrupted her thoughts. Derek Morrison stood there, looking more like a regular teenager than the calculating manipulator he'd once been. "Miss Chun? Do you have a minute?" "Of course, Derek. What's on your mind?" Derek entered the room hesitantly, still adjusting to interactions where he wasn't trying to manipulate or dominate. "I wanted to thank you for what you did. I know that sounds weird, considering how it all went down, but you've realized you were headed down a destructive path?" "Yeah, Dr. Martinez helped me understand that if I'd kept going, I probably would have ended up just like my father, successful in the short term, but ultimately isolated and surrounded by people who fear me rather than respect me." Elsa nodded. "Fear-based relationships are ultimately hollow, Derek. They require constant maintenance and escalation to remain effective. I've been thinking about what you said about choosing what kind of person I want to be. I want to be someone who builds things instead of destroying them. What does that look like for you?" Derek straightened slightly, showing hints of the confidence he'd once wielded so destructively. "I've been accepted to Georgetown for next year, same school you went to. I'm thinking about studying international relations, maybe following a path similar to yours." Elsa raised an eyebrow. "Public service? Maybe, or diplomacy. Something where I can use my understanding of how people work to solve problems instead of creating them." "That's a worthy goal, Derek. Though I should warn you, legitimate leadership is much harder than manipulation. It requires genuine empathy, integrity, and the ability to admit when you're wrong." Derek smiled, and for the first time it seemed completely genuine. "Good thing I've got 4 years of college to practice." As Derek left her classroom, Elsa felt a sense of satisfaction that was different from anything she'd experienced in her previous career. In the CIA, success meant preventing disasters that the public would never know about. In education, success meant watching young people discover better versions of themselves. The final bell rang, ending another day at Lincoln Valley High. Students filed out of classrooms chattering about homework, weekend plans, and college applications, normal teenage concerns that had been overshadowed for too long by fear and manipulation. Elsa gathered her materials, thinking about the lesson plans for next week. Mrs. Patterson was fully recovered and would be returning on Monday. But the district had offered Elsa a permanent position teaching AP literature and psychology. She'd accepted, realizing that her unique combination of skills was exactly what modern education needed. As she walked through the hallways that had once echoed with whispered fears about Derek Morrison's latest campaign, Elsa heard something much better: the sound of students laughing, studying together, and treating each other with basic human decency. Sometimes, the most important battles weren't fought in war zones or foreign capitals. Sometimes they were fought in high school classrooms, where the stakes were the future character of young people who would someday shape the world. Derek Morrison had learned that actions have consequences, that real strength comes from building others up rather than tearing them down, and that true leadership requires integrity rather than intimidation. It was a lesson that would serve him well in whatever path he chose, whether in diplomacy, public service, or simply being a decent human being. And Elsa Chun had learned that her years of training in reading people, countering manipulation, and standing up to bullies had prepared her perfectly for the most important mission of all: teaching the next generation to be better than their worst impulses. In the end, both teacher and student had discovered that the most powerful transformations happen not through force or fear, but through understanding, accountability, and the courage to choose growth over stagnation. Lincoln Valley High was now the kind of place where learning could flourish, where students felt safe to be themselves, and where bullies learned to become leaders instead. And it all started with one substitute teacher who refused to be intimidated by a 17-year-old boy who thought he was untouchable. The bullies had tried to embarrass the teacher publicly. Instead, they'd learned the most valuable lesson of their lives: that true strength comes from lifting others up, not tearing them down. Derek Morrison was eating his words, but they turned out to taste like the first bite of genuine self-respect he'd ever experienced. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.